introduce Roy. It's going to be a brief introduction because I don't believe in long introductions, although there is going to deserve a long introduction.
You know the story about Kissinger? Before Kissinger was an American speaker, so he came to stage and he was the next speaker. So the person who introduced Kissinger said, the next speaker does not need any introduction. So he said, no, please introduce. I'm not Kissinger.
So as I believe in short introductions, Roy today is doing a lot of stuff about technology and is an advisor, special advisor to the Arnon joining office, as mentioned earlier. But in the past, he used to be the legal advisor of the National Security Council, and he's been there through very interesting times. And I think it was prior to his departure when he went to Harvard to do your LLM.
No, actually, we didn't.
Yeah. And he has a very, very interesting combination of knowledge from the legal, practical, and technological aspects, which makes him very, very interesting speaker, and we are very honored and happy to have you with us.
Okay, thank you very much. So, should I wait or are we missing anybody? Okay. So I'll just say, how much time do I have?
We have about, let's say, an hour total.
Okay. Well, that will be brief, which means I will have you.
You'll have a discussion and see.
No, okay. I think when I spoke to you the first time, well, my passion is actually about sort of like a different issue, which I'm not going to mention about. I'm just going to say what it is because it actually connects to the last comment Eli mentioned before. My passion is about legal aspects of emerging technologies, and especially the interplay with national security. I'm talking about blockchain technologies and IoT, cyber technologies, of course, and so on. I'm writing, I'm reading, I'm speaking about those issues, and I think it's actually this is actually a great place to the center for those kind of issues, and I'm happy to hear that you're doing much more. I will not. This is the issue. It's like every Jewish guy has two synagogues. The one which he attends, and the one which he will never attend. So I'm not going to speak about that issue. I'm going to speak about the change in the nature of warfare, and maybe towards the end part to mention what we can be learned from the Israeli experience. So as an Israeli practitioner, someone who's been, I think, around for the last 10 years now. Actually, this time is my age. Within the Israeli national security system, I want to start with a more general overview of some of the changes and some of the characteristics which I see in the nature of warfare. Some of them are obvious, and some of the examples will not be familiar. And the first which we mentioned, and this is part of the discussion, is, used to looking at wars or conflicts, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 2,000 years ago, it used to be between two militaries. If you look today, around the world today, most of the conflicts, if not all of the conflicts, almost all of the conflicts, are not between two countries, two states, are between states and non-state actors. And this has a dramatic consequences on a lot of things, which will be mentioned in a few minutes. Even in Israel, no two non-state actors are the same. So it's different. The conflict with Hezbollah in the north is different from the conflict with Hamas in the south, or even some of the Palestinian extremists in the West Bank. So non-state actors, not only it's non-state actors, not states, it's non-state actors that are different from one to another. Not to mention ISIS and so on and so forth. This is a huge difference from what we've seen in the past, and this is what we're going to see much more in the future. It goes back to the asymmetry of war, which we discussed in the previous conversation, and we'll mention it again. The second is war among people. I call it war among the people. Most of conflicts today are not isolated from where civilians reside, live, operate, and so on. The home front has become the front. We've seen it all over the place, even within Russia and Ukraine. We've seen a lot of action happening within civilians or within civilian populated territories, which is a characteristic of what we've seen today. So while in the last century or so, we've seen major wars were fought on the battlefield, now we see much more wars being fought with civilian actually living reside. The third characteristics, I call it the multi-dimensional conflict, and I'll use this board. Sure, it's actually very important to also to what you're doing here. In the past, and I'm talking about 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, you can choose. Most of the conflicts were actually had two dimensions. One is the military, two military fighting each other, and the second is diplomacy. There's the big saying that military is another form of diplomacy. War is another form of diplomacy. You have politicians discussing, negotiating treatments and agreements, and you have military being fighting, and then the war was decided in these two dimensions, these two points. Modern warfare is actually much more complex, comprising at least three, maybe four more dimensions, which I mentioned. One is economic. This is part of the conversation with Yigal. The idea of fighting an economic war, which is part of the dimension, the multi-dimensional facet of warfare, is actually important because war is being won on the military front, sometimes on diplomacy. Also, if you lose your ability to fight because of economic reasons, it's actually crucial. When you go back to cyber front and so on, you see much more. Then you have the media or the PR, or whatever you want to call it, because we've won, even in our case, in Israel, because sometimes we had a decisive victory on the battleground, but in terms of the media, we have lost the public opinion, which dramatically influenced what kind of achievement we could have gained from the same conflict. So what is the media, what is the perception that happened in the battlefield is actually an important factor today. The fifth would be legal, the legal fund, which we are discussing today, and I'll mention more of that later on. And then there may be a sixth one, before we go to the seventh, which I tend to call it it's like the Olympics. This is why I like fire, but there's a sixth one. It's public resilience. Maybe it's a softer one, but it's super important. You may win a war in terms of, or any conflict, or any operation, in terms of military might, or economically you'll be fine, even the legal, everything is fine, but the public is not resilient. They leave the country, they move to somewhere else, they're afraid of the next kind of conflict, you pretty much lost what you're trying to achieve. So when you're trying to look at the modern warfare, you're looking at all these kind of dimensions and how they interplay. So we found about a few years ago, I was speaking at the conference, he said, it's not single victory, it's synchronized victories in which you have to aspire. And this is actually turns to be very hard. And I think Israel is in many, many senses on the bleeding edge of this multi-dimensional intensity conflict because of some of these situations. So sometimes we are on a military, the asymmetrical conflict, which has we have the military advantage and so on. Then when we have the legal advantage, the media advantage, the policy and so on, we have to be aware of that. This is another super important characteristic, and all of that, by the way, translates into cyber. So you can look at the military on the cyber side, the diplomacy, you can look at the legal side, all of that on the cyber. So it adds another dimension to the multi-dimension, which turns into a 3, 4, 5, 6 dimension, which actually it's actually even hard to think about how do you translate it with So this is another characteristic. I'll move to the next ones quite quickly. The information revolution, the IT revolution, has even raised at least two more called fronts, not to say dimensions. One is the use of social networks like Facebook, Twitter, and so on. We see much more of that, even in the last year or so, with what is called the knifing intifada. We've seen that most of the people who have actually went out and carried in any attacks were actually influenced by the social media. This is something that was dramatically changing. And go back to 2011, what's called the Arab Spring, and how it's like a revolutionizing ideas migrated from Libya to Egypt, to Tunisia, to so forth. just to bring it back, it took, for revolution to be, I may say, to be
Exported.
exported or migrated. It took decades, sometimes few decades, because how it usually happens, there's a basic idea, there's a philosophy. You harness the hearts and minds of those who are feel connected to the philosophy. And then there's migration from one place to another. They export the philosophy and the idea, the ideology, Marxist ideology, whatever. And that takes years. And now it took like a few days. Because of the use of technology and information and social networks. And it's, while technology, and it goes back to the basic, my first slide in most of my lectures actually it shows the exponential growth of technology and the linear growth of our ability to think about what technology does to our lives. So social networks, and the second point is the use of technology to actually for warfare or for the use of terrorists like Snapchat, and we've seen Facebook and of course Twitter, and we've seen much more of that happening as well. So not even in terms of, because all technology can be used for good, like a knife. A knife can cut a person and you can cut it with sand, like silence. So technology can be used for the good and for bad, and you have to remember that. So it could be social networks is also good. Export ideas is also great. It also can be because of revolution, it also can be used by terrorists. Cyber I will not mention here. I think it's a great place to discuss cyber, but this is another consequences. And the last point in terms of characteristics of the change in the nature of warfare, and this sort of like opens the next, or the second part of my talk is we have different conflicts, pretty much the same rules. And that tension between so many different characteristics and the basic rules that govern IHL and the law of armed conflict are pretty much have not changed in the last 50 years. No, even more, 7 years. To one may argue, flexible enough, like I think Yigal argued earlier, flexible enough to accommodate what the development in technology and development in where the actually the conflicts are. And other way they say there is need to be a dramatic change in the current rules. I'm going to leave you with that point because I want to build into the next stage. So I take a wider view about modern liberal democracies struggling to provide adequate security because of the following reason, which I'm going to mention. Because I think that the tension of same rules in a different country goes back to the how I think liberal democracies are looking at the specific change in the nature of warfare. The first, when modern liberal democracy, I'm thinking about Israel and the States and Europe and many other countries, they're always constantly facing changing environment and threats. We like to say that you always fight the last war. You look at the last war, you study them, the next war is going to be certainly different. Threats are changing all the time. The threats we have been looking 2, 3, or 5 or 10 years ago will not be the same threats 5 or 10 years from now, not even 2 years from now. Today, most of the conversation today in the Israeli context, but also in other contexts as well, is about non-conventional weapons being used. You see what's happening in Syria. That's like a kid's game in terms of what can happen with real, from chemical, biological, and used against populated areas. So the constantly changing threats require you as a modern democracy to constantly change the kind of approach to different threats that can happen. It's very hard to do it because of some of the constraints. One of them would be living in a liberal democracy. We have human rights, we have human rights consideration, and changing a philosophy because of something that hasn't yet happened. That's going to happen. I'll touch that in a second when we talk about intelligence. The second constraint, I would say, is limited resources. We are always, and all democracies of all countries have limited resources. So it's not like you can do everything you like. You're always balancing between, building more classrooms, building more roads and transportation and so on and so forth, or investing in national security. And eventually it goes back to human rights. Because I want to live in a society in which, I respect my privacy and I build more roads and so on, it's comfortable life and so on, but I also want to be secure. And sometimes it goes together in terms of resources, it competes. You have to remember that that's the essence, and I've been many times in a lot of discussion with the question whether we want to protect our civilian aircrafts or build 500 more schools. That's about the number. 500 more schools. So you can do the number of how many kids in, or we want to protect civilian aircraft. So the basic answer is we will do both, if you can. So you have to remember resources to resources. The third constraint, and also value, is keeping normalcy or day-to-day life flow. I'm sometimes proud, I think, for example, the recent terror attack in the Savannah market, I think it happened about 3 months ago. It actually happened underneath my office building, so I feel nice video. I left before, luckily. But what I take from that, from those of you who are not aware of it, it's two Palestinians arrived in Tel Aviv, well-dressed Palestinians arrived in Tel Aviv with shotguns and bags, concealed bags. They sent for coffee and a cake in one of the most popular places, very popular place in Tel Aviv, Savannah market, it's a nice place. And then after coffee or whatever, they pulled up with shotguns and began shooting, causing 4 got killed and I think about 1,000 injured. Eventually one was shot, the other was captured. By civilians, by the way, before the police actually came in, and the police came in later and so on. But it symbolizes, and what I was struck about an hour and a half later, after the incident happened, the chief of police of the district of Tel Aviv was on all mainstream networks and said, "We've declared the event over and back to normal life." The government, I was very proud of that. Hour and a half at the scene, people got killed, injured, and he was able to then say, "It's over. You can go back to what you did." As an Israeli, I'm saying that. But it goes back to the key messages countries and democracies are fighting terrorism want to persuade is we're going to live normal life. And normalcy is going to be back even though we are facing terrorism. I think it's super, super important. Those countries who are stopping everything because of a terrorist attack are far, for the long run, will find it hard actually to defeat terrorism. The fourth point, the last point, which I deal with it now, is actually human rights and international law. That's a constraint on modern liberal democracy, able to be to fight terrorism and to provide enough security to its people. Now, it's a constraint doesn't mean that it has. Sometimes a constraint is not a bad thing. It's something that you want to. What I'm going to do now is actually mention some briefly, because we can delve into each one of the issues and have a discussion. So take some points and actually give you some of the dilemmas that have been caused because of the tension between the need to provide more security and some of the constraints which are mentioned. I'll start with the intelligence. I think it goes back to your point earlier, and it builds on your point. Intelligence, fighting is a key, crucial component. It's so component. I would even say that without intelligence, like shooting in the dark. Because if you go back to old warfare, the main question used to be, where is the enemy? I know who's the enemy. I just need to find the enemy, and then, that's my view. Today's question, especially with terrorism, it's not where is the enemy, it's who is the enemy. Because terrorism is not about, it could be an innocent civilian in the morning and a terrorist in the evening, like those two perpetrators in the Savannah. Well-dressed civilians came on a train or came on a bus or took a taxi, behaved like normal human beings, drinking coffee at a coffee place, and then turn into terrorists in 1 second. So who's the enemy? It's a super, super important question. That's not going to be, the answer is not going to be by their uniform. They're not wearing uniforms often. The answer is not going to be by any kind of badge or any kind of label. It's only going to be by information. Now, Sometimes you don't have any information. Like they go from just the online market attack, but often it's going to be by intelligence. But for you to have the ability to know who's the enemy and who's not, then you have to have a pretty significant, robust intelligence coverage, information coverage. You have to build a system in which you have a lot of information. So, and the better intelligence you have, the more precise you can be when you react. So it goes back to the principles of international law. You want to be very precise. You want to avoid any collateral damage. You don't want to be, you want to stop innocent people for no harm done. So you have to have the right intelligence. But the problem is collecting intelligence comes at a cost, a huge cost. If you're talking about visual intelligence, if you're talking about signals or what you listen to, or even electronic, or awesome, even open source, all of that, there's a tension between all of that privacy issues. And we have got used to our privacy being invaded by others, multinational corporations like Google and Facebook. I accept all the terms, and every time you download the WhatsApp, I accept. They get access to everything you like or not. If you want to use WhatsApp, and you don't want to pay for it, so they got used to it. But still, with the amount of collection of intelligence and information on individuals, it's unprecedented, and it's going to be even more so in the future. It can go back to the discussion in the US now today with the NSA's collection of intelligence on human beings. And even if you're talking about that, that's about vision, OSINT, and SIGINT, but what about human? Human is even more so. It's not only about privacy in human, often it's about human dignity. Because what's human? It's human intelligence. It's the kind of intelligence you collect by using human beings to manipulate vulnerabilities and weaknesses of others to collect information about a specific person. You get that. It's really hard to collect human intelligence without using some kind of weaknesses. I'll give an example. You go into a coffee place, you sit by a person, which is probably your target, and you start speaking with that person, and you find out that that person could be, in depth. He has depths to other person as well. This is a card which you're going to play something with. That's human intelligence. It sounds like a messy business, like a dirty kind of a job. It is. But that's human intelligence. And a lot of operations. And precise intelligence is based on human intelligence, whether we like it or not. It's not only the Israeli context, it's all context. Now that's in tension with the human dignities, with the method of operation. Some is allowed, some is not, and we have to consider that. So only intelligence as an example of the kind of tension that is created between our need and willing and desire to provide more security. That's like the kind of methods we have to use for that to happen. Another example, operational measures. Oh, well, I have so many examples, but I'm going to use one because it's in the mainstream discussion now. We don't use it. Was that case years ago. So we can discuss rules of engagement, we can discuss pre-warning methods, we can discuss roof knocking and so on. I want to discuss actually the targeted killing. Because it's been Supreme Court decision, all of you can read the decision, it's been translated into English and so forth. I was among the team that when the issue was initially raised 16 years ago, about 16 years ago, we were thinking about what are the conditions in which you can actually decide if you're going to target suspect, which is not I'll explain in a second, and eventually, cause his death or serious injury. And we've discussed that. This is what's nice about it. You asked me from listening what I did. What's nice about some things we've done is actually it's uncharted territories in many senses. So you're looking to expand the boundaries of what's allowed and what's not allowed in terms of IHL and your interpretation beyond this and what's being discussed and so on. So this kind of discussion actually is very important because this is the kind of places in which you actually begin to develop some of the ideas that may, for good or for bad, depends how you take it, influence others or make a decision. But then we're thinking about the conditions, and we care about the three conditions. eventually the conditions, with the addition of the conditions were good, but it's important. Let me just briefly mention the conditions in which you can actually conduct targeted killing. Although you will not aware of targeted killing, it's the act in which you can decide that someone is perpetrating a kind of attack on your country, whatever. You can target that person before that attack happens. So the conditions were, your target is sufficiently high in importance. So it's not like someone is only, a small fish in a big pond. It's actually has to be significant. The measure is not used as a punitive action, but rather to stop any future attacks. There is no practical alternative of arresting that person. This is why there is no targeted killing in the West Bank. Because practically, although we have to risk lives, we can arrest that person. It's not the same in Gaza or in other places around the world. The potential for collateral damage is taken into account. This is a major issue. It goes back to the Shahada case, which Shahada was killed, but along with Shahada, 14 other innocent lives were taken. And this Shahada caused a lot of tension and a lot of discussion. By the way, Shahada is an interesting case because after the Shahada case, there was another incident which did not receive a lot of publication, in which we knew that all of the senior commanders of Hamas were centered intelligence, very accurate, in one place, and instead of using a one-ton bomb like Shahada, they used a smaller bomb, and the second floor got hit, and they were on the first floor. None of them got injured, and they were all asleep. So this is like a major game changer, which happened because we're trying to minimize collateral damage, and we actually lost the military necessity because of minimizing collateral damage. So it's not as famous, but these two things happen. I don't think we're not regretting that. Maybe some do, but I think it's part of the balancing, the checks and balances that we are taking, precautions we're taking. That all targets are approved by senior officials. Often in targeted killing, it is approved by the Minister of Defense himself. And this is super important. It's not a commander on the field. It goes ranks. And the more it goes higher, there's more likelihood that someone's going to ask additional questions and the thing's going to be balanced in a better way. And the last point, I think it's super important. I'll go back to that towards the end of this presentation. It's the Supreme Court eventually can review each of the cases, not before it happened, but after the case, after it happened. And if something goes wrong, someone could be held liable for what happened post-action. So it's not going to save the life of someone innocent, I know, but it's going to make us, the decision makers, the legal advisors, the commanders, much more vigilant about what we're doing and what we're recommending, because we know there are consequences. There are consequences. So this is only one example of operational measures which are balanced because of the constraints. We do try to provide more security, but we are constrained by, in this case, international laws can happen. What is a lot organized. Another good example, which is a different category, is administrative measures. Luckily or not, I used to be part of my job to go into office in Washington institution and try to explain some of the administrative measures as well as been taken, demolition of our houses and administrative detention and so on. By the way, most of these measures, it's always good to blame someone else. Most of these measures were adopted because of the British mandate regulation that has been incorporated into the Israeli law from 1945, so and on. So it's not an Israeli invention, it's not the Arab nation invention, but it's being used by Israel in certain contexts, whereas some criticism, internal criticism, or external criticism. I think over the years, what I'm seeing more and more, and I'm trying to be objective as I can in that sense, is we've seen Israeli policy changes along the years in terms of applying administrative measures because of the criticism, but also because of the understanding of the right the right balance that should be between human rights, human rights, and some of the measures. What's also important to understand, and I mentioned earlier about the judicial review, any administrative measure applied by Israel is being reviewed by the judiciary. Often in very short period of time, whether it's confiscation of property or whether it's administrative, which is mandatory, judicial review and so on. And the review actually makes it even harder, or makes it maybe harder is not the right word, makes it the process of making a decision about any administrative measure much more vigilant, much more careful, careful consideration, involving more legal advisor, which is important as well. Also more professional opinion about what can happen, what cannot happen, what's kind of the consequences of each one of the actions. So administrative measure, but by the way, administrative measure is super important, at least in my mind, to fight terrorism. Because while most of the other kind of measures are punitive, this is kind of the only measure that actually can avoid or can stop terror attack before being happened. And I'm not talking about killing a person, I'm about taking property, confiscating property. Sometimes it's about restricting the movement of individuals. And even in Israel, it's been applied on Jews and Arabs, on Palestinians and Jews. So if it's proper violence, if you have sufficient evidence, sufficient information, which is really, it's not reasonable, it really proves to the amount of certainty I can prove that someone is perpetrating any kind of an action, and you can stop them by administrative measure, just in my mind, it's much better, and it's balanced, it's much better than actually punitive measures. It's really stop the terror attack. Again, we are trying to provide more security to our citizens, and this is one of them. I want to deviate, but I'm going to move to another dilemma, you may call it, balancing between national security and some of the constraints. It's about protection of critical national infrastructure. Now this goes, we have to provide protection to our water facilities, electricity, central bank, transportation, and so on. It's not only Israel, it's many other countries as well. By doing so, sometimes we have to limit, or we have to consider some basic human rights. I'll give you one example, which I was involved in. In 2006, I think, maybe 5, I was sitting in a committee, in an intergovernmental committee that was looking at different infrastructure in Israel and thinking about what is the next infrastructure that we have to provide more protection from cyber attacks. I was there, 12 years ago. One organization that came to our mind was the Israeli Stock Exchange. Believe it or not, it's a private organization, it's a private company. It's not government owned. Now, and it's highly regulated, but then it was not highly regulated in terms of cyber attacks. It's super vulnerable. Just imagine what can happen if the stock exchange is being hit by any cyber attack about to the Israeli economic industry. And we came to them and said, you've got to be guided by a special agency then within the ISA, now it's going to be moved to the counterterrorism, and so it's National Cyber Bureau, these are the national new established set. But then it was part of the ISA. We said, they're going to guide you, we have to add you to the specific legislation that allows them to provide you with the kind of instruction. So we went to them, and I remember the discussion, we're sitting in this kind of, not this one, but this kind of setting, and said, we want to add you to the legal platform that allows you to give you the instructions, and it's going to be a dialogue, it's not going to be enforced, and so on. And we were supposed to say, great, and their response was right away, we said, no, you can't do that. They have a very good reason, by the way. The reason was we are part of the international community of stock exchanges, and being guided by an Israeli security agency will not do good for us in terms of reputation, credentials, and so on. Eventually, it was a year-long discussion in which we got them convinced that we can do it the other way. We used the Israeli Central Bank, and we used some kind of a mechanism, and we started working with the Israeli Stock Exchange, which is comforting because I know how targeted they are in terms of those who actually want to be targeted. And up until now, nothing happens to the Israeli Stock Exchange, but it gives you an example as where you want to balance some of the considerations, which are civilian economic consideration, with our national security interests. So it's not about fighting the enemy this time, or the enemy sometimes could be within. It's about actually working with your own agency, your organization, in infrastructure, which turns into be not easy. Not easy at all. And if I'm looking at national security interests at large, now we can see many more examples. Recent issue of compelling, just in the news this week, coercing, compelling, enforcing, whatever you want to call it, Facebook and Google to take off inciting materials. This is now it's in the news, recently news. Yesterday or maybe 2 days ago, the Ministry of the Interior Affairs and of Homeland Security, wherever he calls himself, the office, and the Minister of Justice were meeting with Facebook representatives about inciting content that Facebook allows to be published on their pages, which we know for a fact that influences the minds and hearts of individuals to take action with terrorism. Now, Facebook is a global company, a multinational corporation, operates in 190 countries. They do not take any orders from the Israeli government, not from the American government. And then comes the tension. Now, we all want to provide more, so our freedom of expression is to publish posts on our walls. But we have to balance it with some of the national security interests, and the way to do so is actually not easy. It's complicated. We still haven't figured out the way to just not only us. Most of the world will figure out. And the second example would be the Apple case. Some post-San Bernardino attack about a half a year ago, where the NSA asked Apple to provide the company with a backdoor to some of the information that was on one of the phones. But they actually asked to provide not only one of the phones, but to the entire system, because the Apple encryption is actually harder for the NSA to crack. Now, it's funny because I know that some of the companies, Google and Apple, spend much more resources in governments, maybe not the US government, but many other governments in terms of encryption. They need the backdoor to actually get access to some information. But Apple was so proud of saying we will not yield to the pressure applied by the US government. And you know where the public opinion was? It wasn't with the NSA. It was basically in charge of their security. It was with Apple. It was in charge with their, I don't even know what it is. Leisure, privacy, whatever. So this is a tension which we're going to see much more of it because of, first of all, the power multinational corporations have within their capacity in terms of technology, but also because we do need to find some kind of a way to work with those kind of technological giants to balance between the tension of national security and other.
Would you expect such public reaction without Snowden?
Snowden was a catalyzer, for sure. It's playing hypothetical kind of thinking. I think Snowden really capitalized the kind of approach of saying, NSA is not really taking care of my interests. But I do, coming from within the Israeli, I can say that a lot of it is really, maybe not everybody is going to agree about the methods and means and so on, but about the result, we all want to provide ourselves more security. We don't want people to roam on the streets, we don't want people to get hurt, or injured and so on. So the question comes up to the cost and the price. And I think that question is not decided yet. There is no consensus about it. And it moves me to the last point of my conversation before we can open it up, which goes back to this perspective. And I share with you 3 insights. You can take it the other way you want. These are my personal insights, of course. But it's based on my experience. And only 3, we can discuss much more, but I think 3 will be enough. So first of all, is providing national security, providing more security requires total effort. Not only because of the multi-dimensional conflict, because the home front is the front, the soldiers and civilians are both involved. The MOD is not more important than the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the Ministry of Finance, or the Ministry of Internal Affairs. All of them are in the same pond, trying to figure out ways to work together. So Ministry of Justice is not less important. And it is super significant because we used to think that, it's a conflict, it's a war, that's the Ministry of Defense. Oh, no, it's not. It's some aspects of it are within the Ministry of Defense, but many aspects are not. And now when you look at the table that discusses cyber issues, you're going to find representatives almost from all departments. That's reality. I've done it in 2006. We were sitting large desks with many right there, like 40 around the table. Why? Because the Ministry of Energy, that is in charge of the electricity company, is super, super important. And also the Ministry of Agriculture was in charge of the water facility. It's a super important person around this. And we have to think about wars in that sense. I know it goes back to the philosophy of war, the war between people, the war between countries, between government and people, and so on and so on. We can discuss that. I think it's more philosophical than I'm a practitioner, so excuse me for not delving into that. But still, I think in the multi-dimensional kind of conflict, you're going to see much more people around the table. The second insight would be about the balance. And I divided that into three pointers as well. That's my Army military experience divided into three. And the first one would be different countries will find different balances. This is why I'm always very careful about looking at other countries without understanding the context. And this is where I go back to no points in the earlier discussion. The context is super important. The balance is being decided by the context, and in different times you may find different balances. So in the midst of 1996, we had 2002, when we had major terror attacks on Israeli cities, I would see the Israeli Supreme Court, the legal advisor, the executive, the commanders, the politicians, and so on, find a different balance than we do maybe today. Within one country, maybe the persons haven't changed much, but the context has changed. And I think as from the international, from IHA point of view, we have to accept that. The balance is super important. In different countries, will strike different balance, and in different contexts, in different times. Second point, I know that will cause a lot of conversation later on, but I think that's the second point would be, by the way, in my discussions with my European friends and European scholars, it's often European, because Americans have been more tending to my approach. It's hard for them to accept that notion. They look at IHL as something that it's a norm that everybody is obliged to, and we have to accept that. But within these kind of norms, there are a lot of concepts which are broad concepts which can be interpreted in different ways. This is why I have a lot of issues with the ICC, or not with the ICC as an organization, also with that, but with the approach that's being taken by some of the judgment in the ICC, because I have to look at the context. It doesn't mean that I disagree with some of the decisions, with some of the approaches. The second point would be there needs to be an open dialogue between the executive branches and the legal branches. I think in that sense, we've, at least in my experience in Israel and some others around the world can attest to that, we've developed a really unique mechanism of which we have an open dialogue between military commanders, politicians, lawyers, legal advisors, and even the judiciary. This open dialogue raises the questions of problem beforehand, discusses some of the problem, changes some of the decisions, and if you don't have that, then the entire discussion will be different. Because we have the power, I was part of the judge advocate general, we have the power of indicting commanders for wrongdoings in conflict. That's not the purpose. We may end up with that in certain cases, but the purpose is actually avoiding unnecessary harm before it happens, not after it happens. And that requires a dialogue. And the dialogue doesn't happen during an operation. It happens way before an operation, years before. And part of that would be what weapons are we using, what are the methods, in which cases, what is the process, how the rules of engagement will look like. It requires a lot of discussion, many hours. So lawyers and legal advisors have to really understand international law and the scope and boundaries and where are the gray areas and white areas and so forth and that. And military commanders have to understand the kind of legal perspectives brought into the table before they make decisions. And if in the end of the game, wrongdoing happened, even though the discussion happened, there's also another tool, which is indicting, which you can use the criminal account. But the discussion has to happen. And the last point in that respect is the importance of the judicial review and judicial authority, at least in Israel. I think we have I know that it's topic of a lot of conversation now, and a lot of criticism happening in Israel. But I think we've got to the point in which I think everybody, most understand the importance of Israeli Supreme Court in balancing and serving as a balance, especially when it happens to warfare. A lot of my American friends raised an eyebrow when I was telling them about some of the decisions made in Israel. Some happened just while violence is still in the midst of violence, while the forces were in Gaza or in Lebanon, or where the Supreme Court sat in Jerusalem and discussed the matter. It seems strange to them, it's not coming. But I think it's not, in hindsight, you can't looking at those events. I'm someone who was actually in 2002 spent a full week in Jerusalem, practically sleeping on the steps of the Supreme Court because we had petition after petition after petition. We had to respond. I'm getting the brigade commander on the phone from where he was, telling me the facts before, and I was to present to the Supreme Court. It actually did a lot of justice eventually because we actually found the right comments. As lawyers, legal advisors, working for the idea, we could say to the commanders, we have to justify what we're doing to the Supreme Court. Let's consider that. It gives us another way to what we're doing. It's not the only one. It's not the only tools we use, but it's also another. And it's also good for the Supreme Court to understand the context in which what kind of actions were done in the context. So I think the 3 points about different balance in different countries, the open dialogue, and the importance of the judiciary in the sense gives us a better perspective. But my last point is, it's actually closes that conversation, opens another one, which I'm not going to discuss today. I mentioned earlier, we used to fight the last war, but we need to prepare for the next. Also, in this kind of distinguished center, we're trying to pretty much discuss what can be the next one. I think it's super important. But technology develops all the time. Methods are changing all the time. I expect that. The challenge in my mind is to create a system which has enough flexibility. It's a key word, flexibility. Among the executive in the following circumstances. First of all, enough flexibility to actually of thinking, or you can translate it into policy. Policy has to be flexible enough to be able to be changed. Because the context will be different, and policy has to be different. So it's not enough for someone, not even military commanders, not politicians, not a strategy, nothing, to say, last war, we've concluded these were the lessons, and this is the policy which we have devised according to what happened last time. What is expected today is to be flexible enough to devise different policies to the different contexts in real time. Second one would be organizational flexibility. Because if you give a knife to a person, they will look to use the knife. As an organization, if the entire organization is built, ground forces, maneuvering, and in artillery and so on, there's not enough organizational flexibility to be able to confront the next. So we have, and I'm not criticizing any military, especially not the IDF, because I think we have a lot of organizations we have developed in the last 20 years, a lot of organizational flexibility, maybe not enough, but we have done a lot in that sense. Versatility and flexibility, but how to create organizational flexibility, not only within the militaries, but also with the executives branches. There has to be flexibility in terms of resources. You can translate into weapons, you can translate into whether I invest in shelters or invest in anti-rockets systems. Or whether I invested in more lawyers and brigades, or whether I invested in more home fund assistance to those people in need. So in terms of flexibility, in terms of resources, and the last kind of flexibility, which that's going to be my last sentence, and it goes back to this table, flexibility in our ability to provide legal opinion, or legal advice, or legal thinking, or even legal approach to what's happening. We have to be flexible enough to understand the context, to understand what it means, to understand where are we going, to be flexible with our legal advice. If we're not going to be relevant to the system. has its consequences for itself, whether it is expected or not. So I'm not preaching to commanders, I'm also preaching to ourselves, as all of us are practitioners and scholars, be flexible enough, because some of the things we are discussing and creating today will be used in the future. Whether the future is going to be 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, or the future is going to be in Israel, in Europe, in Asia, or in America, I have no idea. I'm just saying, this is the kind of thinking that's going to influence others' decision in the future. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you. So the floor is open to comments about one first brief comments. We used to be last two sessions. So that's
Okay. Very similar questions I have for the last session. So, thank you first of all for a very interesting presentation from a practitioner's point of view, be that on the ground and decision making. So my question to you is, how much can we detach politics and political ideology from the end result and the outcome? And for instance, the target is killing. Is there awareness that this ushers in the use of the death penalty in Israel, which is basically legally it's allowed to use that only in treason and to the Nazis as their helpers? So, and not only is the use of the death penalty, as you yourself said, there is no way, there's no trial, there is no way of appealing, and it's decided upon by the administrator that yes, it goes off up to the Minister of Defense, but I'm sure if there's awareness that a Lieberman will have a very different opinion on what constitutes, what merits targeted killing than someone else or others. So, is there a commission of what this does to the legal system, legal norms? And another question is regarding administrative measures. So I wrote my dissertation about the case of Khalid Khima and, among other things, the use of administrative detention. And what I saw there is the whole way of assessing dangerousness as being driven or it's assessed differently in different times, and that constitutes holding somebody in this detention for a definite amount of time could be extended every time. And the fact that she was Jewish, there was much more discretion regarding her case. So we see with Palestinians, there is a much more less discretion, or it's much easier to reinstate them in detention time after time. So I'm just, if you could refer to that.
You want to collect a few comments and then proceed?
I will ask a more normative question coming from a point of a political scientist. You mentioned in the beginning, like the Sarona market and the normalization that you said was something like, from your point of view, very good that after 1.5 hours, you will say we're back to normal. My question would be like, is it really what we want? I have sometimes these challenges with the security policy. Is it really what we want? Or shouldn't we start thinking like, why did it happen? Or like, where are we not just focusing on symptoms? And shouldn't we look like, what is the real source of the disease? Shouldn't we like, would it be maybe also economically more wise to say, okay, we want to see where's the real source of the disease, how can we cure it? Or are we always running after the symptoms?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. You mentioned a very interesting example of the stock exchange, which is a dual entity. That's the proper way to put it in English. And I was wondering to what extent would that incorporate principles of administrative law and constitutional law into IHL. Also was wondering on this point, what does it mean to the doctrine of war sustaining capabilities under 81 Article 2 if we seek, yeah, I know you like it. If we seek to protect our own, does it incorporate maybe a notion of reciprocity? If we're mindful that we want to reciprocity, as if it exists, if we want to protect our own, would we refrain from targeting someone else's? And on this point also, under Article 58 of 81, and the obligation to not locate these kinds of objects in densely populated areas, would someone find himself under an obligation to move away the stock exchange as well from Tel Aviv elsewhere or something like that, for instance, out of the fear that cyber attack would bring down Tel Aviv?
Well, cyber attacks actually makes it easier.
Yeah, it's a, yeah, that makes it, yeah, true.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Yeah.
Okay.
You could, I'm sure there's another round, so why don't
Okay. Oh, make it fast. Okay, so politics, let's start with the politics. Um, so I'm sorry to think between myself whether I can answer as a, I just answer what I've seen. So politics, I can't ignore politics. I don't think any individual can ignore politics in terms of his life and different approaches. I think the process in which things go really gives bigger weight to politics eventually, because most decisions that target the killing as an example, if you know how it works, it goes to so many levels in which you have to recommend, bring more information, show the intelligence information, judge it whether it's enough or not enough. So eventually it comes to like a politician decision, something politics based. There are more consequences to each one decision which have to be taken into account. I'm not ignoring that this could be. So like political decision can impact someone's decision. I'm not saying I'm not ignoring that. I think in the process in which we have played, in which we have seen, that was not the case. That was in politics, knowing some of the decision making, I know their politics was much different. So one was different from one. I do say that in terms of the death penalty and so like the targeted killing, I don't think it's right. It's not good. No targeted killing was, at least in my mind, was improved because of the killing tips. Like, I want to punish that person. Mostly when we looked at the information, it was information that was looking about the person is doing and he's about to be doing. So the idea was stopping that kind of attack, whether it's going to be tomorrow or the day after tomorrow or even an attack that happened a month ago. So the idea was not punishment. And bringing again, it's part of the local armed conflict. It's not part of the system, of the regular criminal system. So I don't think, I know there's a lot of comparison, and some call it extrajudicial killing and so on. For me, it's a different context. It's a totally different context. And one of the proofs I'm bringing, West Bank, in which terrorists are being arrested. Nobody used targeted killing because you can actually arrest. No, that kind of arrest can cost human life.
But wasn't
Okay,
an outcome case, the whole thing where she was showing that the document, she pointed out that Yigal presented and showed that was not legal process, legal procedures were not being followed at every time.
I'm going to the administrative, so you're talking the administrative. I was talking the politics side. The administrative, I'm not discussing the specific case because I'm not aware of the facts as you are, legislation and so on. I disagree with your like mentioned in saying that Jews, administrative attention, Jews gets more attention than others. I think the process is the same, basically the same. I think the law is the same for Jews and Arabs. I've been witnessing many prayers, basically few administrative tensions in which the information is considered, reconsidered every 3 months, every 6 months, and gathers. I don't think Jews are different in that sense. I think in terms of assessing danger, which is the most important thing, this is it's not an exact science. It's not math. It's like in many cases, you have to even judgments in courts are not exact science. So you have to give some room to maneuver to experts who know what they're doing, and just are experiencing that subject. And then, even if you give them room to maneuver, you can criticize them in court. Because the judge sits, gets all the information, she gets all the information, they can go over the case, they can review it and re-review it. There's an appeal process in it. So I trust the system. In many ways, I trust the system. If the system is right, of course there will be incidents, and I'm not talking about the specific case because I'm not familiar with the facts as you are. Some incidents you say this was not done right. The process was maybe good, but they actually entered it wrong. I acknowledge that, but if the process is right and you can go step by step, I trust the process. I will revisit the process, I will relook at the process every few years, but I try to trust the process, and I think all the Supreme Court in Israel many often look at the process, much more about the specific decision, because the decision may change. But the process is what they do around the world. about Catherine, about normalcy. This is it's kind of not about the question is about your approach. For me as an Israeli who've willingly or not learned to live with the terrorism in the surrounding, my ultimate uh, defeat of terrorism is actually going back to my normal life as fast as I can. It doesn't mean we're not sore, we're not painful about human life from either sides. It doesn't mean that we're not like candles in the streets. It doesn't mean it's not going to be in the news, and we're not going to listen to the news every half an hour. Yeah, all these things. It does mean that I think part of the idea of fighting terrorism is maintaining normal. However, like my comments about the gamification, sometimes it gives us like a perception of being sort of like a push, I would say. It's like distant from what's happening, and then the reaction will be distant as well. I don't think that should be the case. I think it's the case, but I think it should be the case. I think that the case should be understanding the consequences, accepting the consequences and the constraints, and also the idea of, for me, going back to normal life is sometimes a constraint. But the idea of going back to normal life as part of the system of fighting terrorism, and then still be considerable of all the other aspects. I don't know if I answer exactly, because the answer is not as from a legal point of view, it's more from political science.
I said it's more philosophical.
More
question,
philosophical.
what you said.
But the point is, just to clarify the point, point is to the extent that you put value in normalcy and utilization, you sort of sacrifice the ability to truly criticize the current situation, because criticism means that maybe you take some of the blame and some of the fault, but what's important is just go back to normalcy, and you face a moral,
Yeah.
cost here.
So I can see the moral cost, which is by the way, one of the other the other tension which I have not mentioned is actually, if you go back, if the scene is going back to normal after an hour and a half, sometimes it's even hard to collect all the evidence in an hour and a half. So take for instance the Boston bombing, you actually have to close a certain area for 3 days to collect all. This is as important as well. Now we have, as I said, we have developed a different balance. So for an Israeli chief of police, it's important to go back to normal, maybe more than collecting all the evidence. Of course, he would say we're doing both, but we know there's a part. I understand the moral value and the moral idea. I think often it's not mutually exclusive in that sense. But I can definitely understand that. But look, as an Israeli, maybe it's different. We see it in the news, it's in the papers. We can't ignore it. We develop maybe more with some kind of resilience towards it, which is important. But the fact that what some Israelis are more resilient doesn't mean that we ignore what's happening. We still look at Israelis, they have developed their own political agenda that goes both ways. Right? Here with the tough questions. Maybe I'll touch the stock exchange because that's okay. So stock exchange was a good example for me because it was really a financial institution, a private company, maybe a purpose company. That today with the cyber crime capabilities, you can actually attack stock exchange without having protection. It's not hard. It's kind of easy to do. You can pinpoint only to the stock exchange. You can even do it to specific stocks. You can do whatever you want. They had to increase the level of protection, which had happened luckily, and that's important as well. If I've never thought of it in terms of IHL. That's for me, it's more actually, and the big legal issue was actually in terms of Israeli regulation. The idea was not in terms of international law; it was more about what can you, what kind of measures you can take to enforce specific regulation or coerce an Israeli entity to take specific precautions and pay for the cost of the specific precautions which you have mandatory require that specific organization to take.
The whole discussion about
That's
around cyber issue, whether it's an attack or not, when the damage is not because the effect is not damage very quickly.
Yeah,
There's a whole discussion. Yeah, the telling one.
the time.
The telling two is another question, which is a countermeasure. It's not impacting the ground. You can use it as a countermeasure.
Telling, of course, is not part of the law yet.
No,
No, but
as I
it's-
say,
as
it
an art.
plays telling one thing
As an
that
art.
when it's not, physical damage
Yeah.
or damage to a person, it's not telling one answer. It's different topic. It's telling one thing that I should currently.
Barack Obama did not accept that when
Yeah.
Sony was attacked, but
But this, so I touched the first part, which is internally, so like, I think it's actually, it's even more pressing, because now, think about stock exchanges times 1,000, because I can even now identify 1,000 companies, organizations, which are with the possession of critical information, of critical assets to our society, which I want to make sure that are properly protected.
like Facebook.
Well, also Facebook. And by the way, they don't hold the information in Israel, so it's even more. Now, you touched the IHL point of view about retaliation, which I don't have a specific opinion, which is different than what Robert mentioned about this trust and so on. I do say that cyber touches the cyber warfare. I think that's after we had a lot of discussions. There was I think we did together, I think in the cyber discussion about warfare during the cyber week of in Tel Aviv. My opinion was still, this is my main struggle with the cyber warfare, was the issue of attribution. One of the issues in cyber is actually attribution. It's really hard to attribute a certain attack to a certain body, especially related to a certain government, and it's not a minor issue. It's a big issue.
Of course, invisibility of evidence,
It's a huge technological forensic
Yeah.
issue. And until that is being solved, I'm really finding it hard really to do retaliation without, to find a kind of legal framework in which you can do retaliation. Because it's really like, it's a basic stuff. If I know it's attacked by Lebanon, I may retaliate or not, and we look at the section 2.4, and we look at the 3.1, and we even look at some of the other kind of the protocol and so on, but if I can't even attribute to specific and provide sufficient evidence as forensic evidence to show the world, then it goes back to something that I'm finding very hard to do. That's, I think, a major issue that scholars will be discussing in the next week. I try to cover all the points, if I missed anything, can
I have a few short points. One, I'm looking at the diagram that you written there. I'm quite sure it's not on purpose, so I want to target you on that. Put media in the middle. Now, before you do
This is precisely why we have the country heuristics.
the question is, do you think any one of the circles should be included? Should have more than 20 things covered? The second one is with regard to administrative measures. As far as I understand the use of administrative measures, they are only to be used when you're unable to use punitive ones. So it's not
doing criminal.
to use criminal ones and
Unclear, actually, under Israeli laws.
well under the will of the court.
Detention is
Basically, detention also simulation. I think if you have alternatives.
Depends which measure, for example, it's a justified clarification. It's a very peculiar thing. In Israeli public law, there's a distinction between possible tension between IHL and Israeli public law. And there's a distinction between detention and the restriction of movement and where you can live. The restriction of movement, the question is, shouldn't you first maybe charge in criminal? But the answer under Israeli law, under Israeli public law is no. So it's unclear whether.
And the third one is with regard to your insight on the balance. When you're saying that during protective edge, for example, the situation is different than today.
Might
And
be perceived.
might be perceived different. And I think that this is a very dangerous mindset because we are already in a state of emergency. And going to emergency within the state of emergency and allowing more restrictions or more ability to the authorities might basically, when you're going back to the regular state of emergency, basically remove any rights you have anyway.
Maybe just one last comment because the time is up, and I don't want to get into the details. I want to be structural / poetic when we combine those two. So my question would go along the lines of what is love? And what I mean by that is it ties back to the question of Catherine and Yigal's last point. Of course, from they attack the same questions. So there's an internal tension because on the one hand, in what basically what you were saying, because on the one hand you said, look, it's really tough to win those circles. And on the other hand, I'd say, well, I think it's tension, you said you gotta be flexible. So what is law? That was the reference, right? So what is law in it? This is just an element of discretion that we play this as if it was some sort of all things considered, I'm making this judgment and that judgment. I grab from the economy, I grab from the media. What would be the impact on diplomacy here? Should I take this into consideration? Should I take the public resilience into? So I make this, I put everything in the blender, I press bzzz, I get the result, it's an ad hoc result. This is what you should do under all situations. Well, you gotta be flexible. But at a certain point, we reach an understanding, well, that's not law. There's something about law that is not flexible to the extent that you take everything into consideration, all these outliers are going to look, because then you lose law. It's not law anymore. And it goes also to the extent of, maybe something should be legal, necessarily, it's in the law. And you say, going back to normalcy, if the price you pay with normalcy, that shouldn't be part of the legal consideration.
So I'll touch it. Oh, sorry, Mom.
Yeah, no, a short one, but I think it's sort of responding to both Katarina's and your comment, specifically about terrorism. If the one characteristic which sets terrorism apart from all other kinds of violence is its psychological implications. It's spatially and socially unbound and temporally unbound. So nothing's going to stay the same. Once you have the terrorist act, even if superficially you go back to normalcy, the normalcy you have afterwards is never going to be the normalcy you had before. So if I think about the construct of your circle there, and you said, oh, you had it all Olympic, and it was nice before you added in public resilience, well, I think public resilience might actually, in the case of terrorism, be in the very middle of it. And now, on law, if the one thing that sets terrorism apart is that nothing ever stays the same afterwards, it'll be really hard for law to deal with it, because law is always exposed. I don't know, but I think resilience should maybe even be in the very middle of it.
We should let go slightly with the requirements of the rule of law because we care more about public resilience.
Okay, but let me go through the comments very briefly. Okay, the media, I got it. It's not intention. And you can, what's important actually here, it's not about where each one of this is located, there's actually a connection between different sectors. So if I have another dimension, I would show it actually, because the legal is important, diplomacy, legal and military, legal and economic, and media is also military. And I can see all the connections and relations which are important in the media. It's important, but it's not the only something important. I can't even say that something is more important than the other because it depends on the context. This is actually an illustration to show us, at least in my mind, to show us the complexity of some of the new kind of conflicts which change in the market. But that's the points towards the end. I mean, the next thing is my point of view, as far as I know, is very low. Is in terms of administrative detention, if you have the ability to take legal criminal proceeding, you have to take this judgment. I think I don't remember the exact name. The judgment you have to take the legal criminal proceeding. It's not. I think it's not the same about restriction of movement. And it's not the same about demolition of houses, which is only administrative. It's not just, there's no limit to demolition of houses. There's actually a big confusion for demolition of houses as a punitive deterrence measure, administrative, and houses are being demolished during the course of a battle, which is, by the way, this is all international conflict, this is different, but there's a lot of confusion about that, which just is in the so administrative in terms of that, in terms of criminality of the ability. Now, the balance and Arnon's comment, look, in the state of emergency, so I don't tie it to the state of emergency, which has been the normal kind of since 48, because this is, we don't act like a state in state of emergency. We still have the state of emergency designated declared. It's because of, and I've been in many discussions within the Ministry of Justice, the new law, I think the new terror law bill that was passed. One of the ideas was setting off the state of emergency and enacting a new kind of legislation. But as it happened many times in Israel, you take new things, new measures, but you don't want to abandon the old ones. So they found a kind of an Israeli Israel law, which actually is Israelis, which actually combines the two together, and maybe in a few years we can declare, we can drop the military regulation, security regulation, and then we can start the state of emergency. So I'm not tying into that. I think the major point is about actually what Arnon actually said the state about what is law and what is law, what is law and what is the boundaries of law. And I'm the one actually saying that the law is actually very important. It's not that it's like in many things that black and white, and we should really tell the difference of black and white. I think 99% of what we're doing is really whether it's black or white. We tend to discuss the 1%, which is really hard. And on that kind of 1%, which is, the roof knocking case, the neighbor's procedure case, and I'm talking about actually cases which went to the Supreme Court of Israel, you can read the cases, everything is in English and so on. These are the hard cases, but it's not the day-to-day kind of cases. And this is where flexibility has to be in place. And in that sense, I'll take 1 minute, I want to talk about the neighbor procedure kind of case, for those of you who are not know, because this is a case in which twice, if I remember right, twice it came before the Supreme Court, in 2 different names, and twice it was decided that it's neighbor and
Minister of Justice turned against the court after the decision. I don't recall.
So the idea was, and I'll tell you about just in case that's the fact.
They targeted killing.
Yeah, but it took 3 years. It was dismissed on the notion of the doctrine of the king can do no wrong. Yeah, but then in the Barak came and said, no, you're not the king and you can do wrong. I'm quoted. Take that out. Neighbor case. It's a great example of that. The idea was a procedure in which you fight in, you go in the middle of the night, time for instance, suspect from the West Bank. But the idea of developer practice is some of the units, if I'm sending a soldier to a door which nobody knows, they're going to shoot me. Because see soldiers, they're going to shoot me. I want to save lives. So what we do, actually knock on the neighbor's door, not neighbor, he can go on and knock on the door, and actually ask the person to come out, and then they're going to be arrested. It seems to the IDF, or seems to be some of the commanders, like a very reasonable kind of approach. It's going to save life, and also going to save life of the civilians inside the house, because if they're not going to go out, then it escalates. So they came up with the approach, and then they came petition before the court saying, it's human children. Basically, if you take a neighbor, although you ask, I'm not sure they asked. They say person
politely enough.
Politely enough, and that person in the middle of the night, you have soldier masks in colors, and they ask you, I want to see you refuse. Okay, it's not really asking, it's not polite enough, and so it's really human. And now if the neighbor is being, so the other said, okay, we'll put a life, like protect the rest on the neighbor. Now, I don't know if it's good or bad, it becomes even worse. I have any suspicion that his life is in danger, even more human. So it came before the court twice, the court said that's not allowed. According to IHL, it's a decision, you can make a decision. I think that's super important, because this is where it wasn't black or white at the beginning. It came before the court, and the court said that's the 1% of the cases. because they said that's a no, that's a black. That's not one. This is what I think.
Court itself did not rely on specific culture. Say there are several reasons. This is why we find it not more unlimited. There is no natural root that's more information. Yeah.
But the interpretation of the general provision of IHL was enough for them to make a decision.
Yeah, the interpretation.
Now look.
Because of the autonomy argument. You're not really in a position to say.
Yeah.
Bottom line, you're not really in a position to say
Yeah.
no to the.
Exactly. I think that was the major consideration. The person is not consently, willingly, is happily.
You can't ensure that he is.
And that's the gray area, which the court has decided that's not, that's because understanding the practice, that's not. So I'm saying law is super important. And basically, as a legal advisor to some, I've relied on the law many times, giving them my interpretation, which was a consensus interpretation, which was a practice. In often cases, which tend to be more the cases we discuss, because these are the cases much more interesting, then you have to show more flexibility, and this is where I'm preaching to more flexibility. I'll stop here. I'll maybe the sentence which I like, law is law, but at the end of the day, it's human being. It's been decided by human being, it's been discussed by human beings, it's been interpreted by human being. We're a human being, so we make mistakes and now we give our common sense, and that's a decision.
So you go back to land, and that's to go to land.
Unlike the artificial intelligence machines that one day is going to govern that, and that's not human being anymore. But that's another discussion.
Thank you very much. Lunch, we got up to Aroma. Just order whatever you want in the menu. And then you have to eat.
We don't have.
I didn't say that.